Well, I was going to speak on the passage here about, first of all, never in the Bible does it say Mary had other children. Nowhere. Nowhere. Bible does not say Mary had other children. It says Jesus had brethren. And the word for that in the Hebrew, or in the Greek, adelphos, I think it is related. There's no word for cousin. It's any close relative, or blood brother and sister. It's any close relative. And so I was going to do a homily on that, but then I thought, no, this passage comes up from time to time. But one of the things that really doesn't come up, but on this day, is the dignity of the worker, the employer, and the employee. Something that has so been shredded over the last few decades, and I think both sides are to blame. My father says all the time, when you hired into General Motors or Ford Motor Company back in the 50s, you guaranteed had a job for life. The employees were so dedicated to the mission. They showed up for work, but yet the company was dedicated to the employees. They gave them pensions, which now have disappeared, extensive benefits, which have now disappeared. And so there's no longer that relationship between the employer and the employee. Well, this is what we celebrate today, St. Joesph, the worker. Now, I apologize. I knew this morning as I was running around, I wanted to do something and I forgot. I think May 1st was chosen by the church because this is the day that communism and socialism celebrate and honor the worker, but under a much misunderstood way. And so what does St. Joesph have to do with all this? Okay, as we just read from Genesis, God settled man in the garden, okay, to cultivate it, to care for it. We know that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So work is more than just a way of making a living. Sadly, that's all it has become in our world today. It's more than that. Work is a form of participation in God's creation. You may not think about this, no matter what type of job you do. Even the most simple task that people make fun of or it's not a good job, every single one gives glory to God. If the dignity of work is to be protected, then the rights of the workers must be respected. And I think that's the point of today. So how do we do that? First of all, the employer must pay a fair wage. Do you know the four sins? What are the four sins that scream to heaven for vengeance? You remember this from the Bible? What are the four sins that scream to heaven to demand justice? One is murder and taking the life, especially of the innocent, so abortion. Two is sodomy. This is when people try to tell you that there is nothing against homosexuality in the Bible. Not only is it a sin listed in the Bible, it's one that screams to heaven for vengeance. All right, so that's the second. What's the third? That we have the obligation to take care of the widows and the orphans. We just don't abandon those in society. And what's the fourth? To pay the worker his just wage. That's how serious it is. Now the question becomes just, because in places like California, they're trying to raise the minimum wage so much that it's putting all the small businesses and medium-sized businesses out of business. So, we have to have some logical thought process behind this. But now, I always tease my employees, like cameraman Giuseppe, when he pointed out to me about, you're obligated to pay me the just wage. So with cameraman Giuseppe, I tease him. I went to Luke 3:4, and it says this in Luke verse 14, chapter 3, verse 14. Do not practice extortion. I told him. He goes, I don't. I said, do not falsely accuse anyone. He says, okay, I don't. And I said, and it says, and be satisfied with your wages. Do not complain about your wages. So just a little fun add on there. But, you know, one of the first papal encyclicals I ever read, you all know my favorite pope in the history of the church is Leo XIII. And Leo XIII wrote the very first encyclical I read in seminary called Rerum Novarum. It was groundbreaking, and it covered the rights of employees and employers regarding work. And it showed that collaboration between the two, not this class warfare. What's going on right now is deliberate class warfare. This whole CRT and critical race theory, this is class warfare. It's trying to destroy the relations between the classes. And Rerum Novarum says, no, that's not the answer. It's collaboration if you want social change, not class warfare. And so in it, it says that the economy must serve the people, not the other way around. And by the way, if you're listening to this, because every single time I get these letters, as I always say, Father, stop talking politics. This is not politics. This is social justice teaching of the Catholic Church. So just needed to say that. Now, this document by Pope Leo XIII supported the rights of the worker, and it started with forming labor unions. Now, I come from Detroit. So, you know, this is a labor town. It's a labor union town. And then I was growing up, I was like, wow, there's a lot of mistakes I'm seeing in these labor unions. So am I for labor union? Am I against labor union? Well, my grandfather's father was an immigrant from Croatia, started some of the very first labor unions in the United States of America up in northern Minnesota for the iron ore mining. These poor laborers were dying every day, and there was no protection. There was no rights of these workers. They were being worked to death. And my grandfather's father, this big strapping, he could crush walnuts between his two fingers. And he was amazing, and he started some of the first labor unions in the history of the United States back at the turn of the century in the 1900s. And Oliver Mining Company didn't like it. They didn't like it, and they hired thugs from Chicago, mafia, and they came up and shot him, gunned him down on his front porch in front of his wife. My grandfather was 6 weeks old at the time that he was murdered. And so my heart, in one sense, is with the unions because of a story like that. But at the same sense, we got to be logical here. You know, we're trying to compete in a world market. So how do you balance all this? Okay. And the reason I'm saying all this is church teaching, and all of you are affected by it because all of us in one way or another are workers, whether it's at home or in the workplace. Now, so this document supported labor unions. It rejected socialism, but it also rejected unrestricted capitalism. I'll mention that in a minute. But affirmed the right also to private property. And so this is important because this document, Rerum Novarum, is a foundational text of, as I said, Catholic social teaching. So workers have the rights to a fair wage, decent working conditions, but people seem to forget the workers have a bunch of duties too before God. All right, what are your duties as a worker before God? Okay, one, that you must be fully and faithful to performing the task which you were hired for. You have a moral obligation. If you're not performing the task you were hired to do, you are in a state of sin for lack of, it's sin of omission, not commission, what you're not doing. Individually, we must refrain from doing harm to the company, either through vandalism, personal attacks on others, gossip. How many of us gossip around the water cooler? This is a moral obligation that we cannot do. And then collectively, to refrain from rioting and violence. Well, just look at the news, what's going on right now, huh? Prayers needed. This is just craziness. Now, the duties also exist for the employers, all right, to provide work suited for each person in the proper way for their strength, gender, and age, to respect the dignity of the workers and not regard them as bondsmen. What's bondsmen? A slave. So they're not to be looked at as a slave like the iron ore workers of my grandfather's father. All right, so to finish here, Leo the 13th points out that no one should be forced to give up their goods. This is communism. And so this is what it spoke out against. Communism forces you to give up your goods. That is not church teaching, all right? But when you are blessed with material wealth, you do have the moral obligation to share. All right? You're not required by the state. You shouldn't be. That's communism. But morally, you should share. And so Leo strongly criticized socialism. And this whole world today is now thinking this is it. Like I said, my niece came home one day. Here's my father in Vietnam fighting for freedom. And she says to him, "What's wrong with socialism? This is the answer." You should have seen the look on my father's face. And my niece, this is what they're learning in school, that socialism is the answer. Just talk to countries like Venezuela and see if socialism is the answer. Well, anyway, Leo the 13th criticized socialism in that it seeks to replace the rights and the duties of parents, families, and communities with the supervision of the state. That's the problem with socialism. You want to know the problem? Because in socialism, the rights and duties of parents and the families, like to teach their children morals, is stripped, given to the state. We will force your children to have to learn about transgenderism or about sex acts in the 3rd grade. That's socialism. It's dangerous. And so the government should only intervene when a family or community is unable or unwilling to fulfill their rights and duties. If a family is begging to be able to keep their children away from this garbage, they have that right, according to Leo the 13th. Greatest pope. And so he spelled this out, and he said, communism, this is when communism was just, Marx was just coming out. He says it's evil. Man in communism must serve the state. The state is God in communism. But in all fairness, he warned against unbridled capitalism, because what becomes the God in capitalism? The corporation. So both are bad. If you've got oppressive communism, the state is God, but if you've got unbridled capitalism, the corporation becomes God. And so what's the answer? You know, I've only seen it one place and nobody talks about it. The answer to all this came from G.K. Chesterton. And he said the answer is the world needs to get back to distributism. What is that? He said distributism is needed as a pro-human economic model based on the family. He said distributism shows the importance of private property. It is a society of owners and families. The property belongs to many rather than a few, so that the corporation is not God. All right? And he said production should be controlled by the families, small businesses. Have you noticed what's happening in the last decade? The destruction of the mom and pops, the destruction of the little family businesses. They're all being wiped out for the giant corporations. And so this is dangerous. So I finished with 2 quotes. One, John Paul II, another fabulous pope in our history. John Paul said, work is an obligation. That is to say, a duty on the part of each person. Man must work because the Creator has commanded it, and because of his own humanity, which requires work in order to be maintained and developed. Man must work out of regard for others, especially his own family, but also for the society to which he belongs, the country of which he is a child, and the whole human family of which he is a member, since he is the heir to the work of generations before him, and at the same time a sharer in the building of the future to those generations that will come after him. This is his work on human work. And I think of that, we owe everything to the people who came ahead of us, that built our country, that built this foundation, that stood up for the workers, like my grandfather's father, that died. He was really a martyr. 10,000 people came to his funeral. And so St. Paul then said, if you do not work, you should not eat. Now, I mean, obviously, if you got handicaps or things like that, I mean, obviously we know that everybody can't physically do the same things. Benedict XVI weighed in. I would like to remind everyone, Benedict XVI said, especially governments engaged in boosting the world's economic and social assets, that the primary capital to be safeguarded and valued is the human person, not the machine. The human person. The human person in his or her integrity. He said, man is the source, the focus, and the aim of all economic and social life. That's from his work, Charity in Truth. So why are we here today? St. Joesph. He's a fabulous example of a worker. St. Joesph was given us the example of not only how to be a disciple of Christ in your spiritual life, but we seem to forget the importance of our normal everyday life. And so in that, we are workers. We are workers in the vineyard. And so St. Joesph shows us how to be a worker in the vineyard. And so the worker needs his dignity, he needs his respect, but at the same time, he has to show up to work. He has to be there. He has to do his part. I mean, what's happening today, when I had my small business, I knew a lot of other business owners, and I still keep in touch with them some time to time. They're saying what they're seeing now is just unbelievable. People not wanting to have to come into work, people not having wanted to work. You ask them to work any extra. When I was working in the Detroit auto industry, you never knew when you were going to get out of work. There was no such thing as leaving at 5 o'clock. You did what it took to get the job done. You were dedicated to the mission. It doesn't exist now as much. And so we pray today to St. Joesph to be able to ask his intercession for the dignity of the worker, the protection of the worker, the promotion of the worker, but at the same time, that they be faithful to the work. It's not just about making a living, it's participation in God's creation. What a beautiful day, and what a beautiful saint to try to think about the real meaning of Catholic social teaching.